Hi, this is Peter Schweitzer, and welcome to the Drill Down, where we relentlessly expose cronyism, corruption, and the abuse of power in Washington, D.C. Joined as always with my co-host, Eric Eggers, who is an author and vice president here at the Government Accountability Institute. Now, Eric, we have talked before about the tragic war that is unfolding in Ukraine on other podcasts. We wanted to revisit it again as the war has now entered the second year. We usually look at issues related to cronyism, corruption as it refers to domestic policy, but we want to talk about it in a global aspect today.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think there's some basic assumptions that have gone unchecked. And I think Republican leadership has actually referenced that the American support for Ukraine is the biggest reason why they've been able to pass massive spending bills. And I think, in my opinion, I could be wrong, but our guest will kind of help us inform us if I am wrong. But I do think that the national attention is sort of rapidly diminishing away from attention investment. It used to be, right? I mean, when the war started, it was on CNN every day.
Yeah.
It was on every news channel every day. We were getting news reports from the field, and you don't really hear about it very much anymore. But there are still people that are making a lot of money off of the war because we're spending a lot of money in aid in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And to be clear, we've said this before, we are fully in support of the Ukrainian people and supporting the efforts to defend their sovereignty and independence. But you do have this problem of people profiteering, people in Ukraine, people in the United States that are going to funnel money. We have this huge problem with Afghanistan, of course. Helping us unpack all of this and the geostrategic side of this as well is Rebekah Koffler. She's a Russian-born U.S. intelligence expert who served as a Russian doctrine and strategy specialist at both the Defense Intelligence Agency. She also did work at the CIA's National Clandestine Service, and she led red teams during war games and advised senior Pentagon officials. You will find her on Fox News and elsewhere. She's also the awesome author of a terrific book called Putins Playground. Rebekah, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Peter and Eric. Such a pleasure to be here with you and your audience today.
Well, give us, first of all, your sense of how the war is going. The reports that we hear is the Ukrainians are holding steadfast. Russia's having to use the Wagner Group and basically criminals to fight this war because the Russian military can't seem to do it. And the only way they can fight this war is with these frontal attacks. But where do you see the war going? And then we're going to talk a little bit about how can we make the war fight more effective and how can we avoid some of the fraud and waste that occurred in Afghanistan and elsewhere. But first, give us your thumbnail of where you think the war is right now.
Sure. Well, this war is unwinnable, Peter. The Russians have captured between 18 and 20% of Ukraine's territory. And as you correctly pointed out, they're bringing everything, in the kitchen sink into this fight. By that, I mean the Wagner Group, which is a bunch of criminals that Putin is releasing from prisons to go and fight in Ukraine. But the bottom line remains is that there's a disproportionate advantage that the Russians hold in terms of the balance of forces and balance of power. Here's what I mean by this. The Russians are using its centuries-old strategy in Ukraine to outsuffer and to outlast the adversary. It's called colloquially the meat grinder strategy. The Russians lost 25 million of their own citizens in World War II. Today, Russian military's losses are about 200,000, with the population of Ukraine 43 million and Russian population 143 million. You can see that Putin has a lot of flesh to throw into that meat grinder. And Ukrainians, despite the fact that they have been fighting valiantly, they have surprised everyone, including our intelligence agencies. But it doesn't eliminate the fact that they simply don't have enough people and enough weaponry, even after 196 billion worth of high-tech equipment has been flown already into Ukraine by the United States or promised this war, unless it becomes unwinnable, in which case the Ukrainians are just going to be slaughtered. It's just basically is unwinnable.
But you just said that the war is unwinnable, right?
Yeah.
And so that kind of puts the amount of money and funding that we're dedicating in aid to the Ukrainian people, which of course now it becomes more of a humanitarian issue and less of a military issue, less of a national security issue. And I have to tell you, one of the things that I'm sort of troubled by is that, in your expert opinion, which I absolutely believe, that this war is unwinnable. One of the things in our research packet here, because as soon as this happens, we're like, okay, why are we so invested in this? Why are we spending so much money? Is this thing a big cash cow for the defense industry, which is, defense spending obviously is a massive thing here in the United States. But our research indicates that actually the defense contractors Lockheed and Raytheon, quote, don't expect a bump in Ukraine-driven sales to emerge until 2024. Which makes me think then that they're invested in perpetuating this war until 2024. Is that possible?
Oh, yes, it's absolutely possible, not just till 2024, but beyond. So here's the two-prong strategy and goal that the Biden administration, which is highly corrupt, and I know Peter has written a lot about that, that they are pursuing. Outwardly, they are saying that, we're helping Ukraine fight for their democracy. Well, that's myth number one. I mean, I love Ukraine, but Ukraine is nowhere near democracy. Zelensky is not a democratic leader. If anything, he's closer to Putin in terms of he's running a one-state party. He has outlawed any kind of independent media. He's sending his security services to interrogate priests and this sort of thing. But because the Biden administration knows that freedom and democracy are hot buttons with the American people, he's manipulating the American people. Underneath, he has two goals, and they stated some of these goals very openly, and that is to weaken the Russian economy and degrade its military. And that will take a very long time because the Pentagon itself has designated Russia as its near-peer competitor. The Russian military, despite all of the mishaps and the tactical, incompetence, the fact of the matter is it's still a top military, and in certain weapon system and in doctrine and strategy, it has advantage over the United States, including nuclear. So, again, the second one, it's all of the corruption, because we have already invested an equivalent of entire Ukraine's GDP, gross domestic product, $196 billion we have already pumped in. Ukraine's GDP for 2021 was 200, right?
And the United States has spent that much. The United States has spent the equivalent of Ukraine's GDP in Ukraine already.
100% true fact. Okay, and it's not a secret. Anybody can go and Google this. But not only that, Eric, Zelensky is quite open right now what this war is about. In the beginning, he was issuing all of these, heart-tugging, tearjerker videos, with children being blown up, and was pleading for more weaponry. Well, right now, he's actually candid. He's having meetings with the Chamber of Commerce at Boca Raton, Florida, with the National Association of Manufacturers, and he is appealing to the investment firms and to the military-industrial complex, saying that this is an investment for you guys. Guess how long it's going to take to rebuild Ukraine if this war were ever to end? $396 billion. I mean, this kind of money, the math is becoming prohibitive because we are in debt. I mean, we have $31 trillion debt that we're saddling our children and grandchildren with. The American people are not stupid. Sooner or later, this whole Russia-Ukraine hoax is going to unravel. Just like the COVID, cover-up unraveled, the same thing is going to happen with the Russia-Ukraine and the true reasons why the Washington elites are supporting this war and why the Biden administration is continuing to fight it indefinitely.
We are talking to Rebekah Koffler. She's the author of a terrific book called Putin's Playbook. She worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency and CIA in a previous life. So, Rebekah, this presents a terrific dilemma for us in terms of making decision makers. Obviously, I think we all here and the vast majority of the American people are sympathetic to the average Ukrainian who is suffering as a result of this war. And yet they are led by this, let's say, ethically challenged leadership. Zelensky, of course, was put into office with the support of oligarchs like Kolomoisky, who is highly corrupt. We've looked at him before. He was involved with Burisma when Hunter Biden was there. He was also reportedly the man who pocketed billions of dollars in taxpayer money with the failure of Privat Bank in Ukraine. So these are the vessels we have to deal with. How do we move forward, Rebekah? My view is let's give the Ukrainians the means to defend themselves in terms of guns, but don't give them any cash because the cash and the financial grants are going to disappear. It reminds me of the Afghan war where the Afghans, it was discovered, had these ghost armies where these military commanders were saying they had 35,000 soldiers under arms. They didn't have any, but they were being paid to provide paychecks for 35,000 soldiers. That could be going on in Ukraine. But the question is, Rebekah, how do we go forward? Presumably, we want to help the Ukrainian people. We don't want corruption. What options, if any, do we have?
Here's my proposed plan. First of all, if you are pro-Ukrainian, if you love the Ukrainian people, you must place pressure on this administration to push Zelensky to settle for peace. Why is that? Is because, as I said, the Russians are using a century-old strategy, the war of attrition. That's how the Russians won every single war. It's just but the relentless attrition of manpower.
And the Russians already have mandatory conscription for a year, right? So any men between 18 and 24 have to serve in the military. So they've got a built-in supply chain of military power already.
Exactly. You just nailed it, Eric. And not only that, Russian Defense Minister Shoigu announced that Russia is going to beef up its armed forces to 1.5 million conscripts. They are already having 350,000 people just ready to join the fight, and additional 150 in training camps. So Putin has been preparing for this for the past 20 years, okay? And unfortunately, we ignored, including the Biden administration, every single signpost of what was unraveling. In fact, I personally briefed, the White House. I briefed every combatant commander that's involved in the European theater, EUCOM, STRATCOM, the commander that is in charge of our nuclear forces. Nobody wanted to lift a finger, right? And right now, what's happening is our ruling elites are openly saying that this is a good investment for us to continue bleeding the Russians out. But they are bleeding Ukrainians. They are real people. I mean, they are men, women, and children. And so for what? To protect Europeans who fail to provide for their own security? Look at this number. Only 8 countries out of 30 provide 2% towards of their GDP towards the collective security kitty, right? Germany, the richest country in Europe, doesn't even provide that. So if you love Ukraine, you must push for this war to end. And then the second thing that I want, Kolomoisky is all right on the money, Peter, that you just said. I don't need to, go over any of that except the fact that our own government banned Kolomoisky and his entire family from entering into the United States because of his massive corruption. He's under investigations. Ethically challenged, like the entire Washington ruling elite is just so ethically challenged. The first plan that I propose is tell the truth to the American people. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, you can't hear the truth because there's almost an embargo with the legacy media. If you say anything, even that is even perceived as negative towards Ukraine, even factual information that we just talked about, such as the fact that Zelensky's campaign was bankrolled by Kolomoisky, you will be banned for these networks and you won't come back. And so truth needs to come out, and that's the first thing that needs to happen.
Rebekah, what I heard you say is that if we really want to support Ukraine, we should give our friends that are German a hard time because they're not carrying their weight. Any German people you know, call them up right now, harangue them for once again perpetuated genocide. So that's essentially my takeaway.
Eric, what do you think Putin was doing back in Eastern Germany? Putin is a KGB operative, right? He was running spy networks in East Germany. That was his job, recruiting spies and penetrating the government. And the German government has not still recovered from the dent that Putin was able to put. Why do you think they generated the dependence on the Russian energy? I mean, there's no coincidence. You know what the Russians like to say, "Это не случайно, товарищ." This is not a coincidence, commerce.
We're going to take your word for it that that's what that means, Rebekah. But what I think is interesting to me is if the Biden administration and the powers that be here are benefiting and if they're pitching this as this great investment opportunity, then in some way, and this is a weird thing to say, but it's almost like Vladimir Putin has done these people a favor by invading Ukraine. I mean, is that part of his calculus that he's like, hey, listen, we can get away with this because people will benefit from the destruction and the havoc that we will wreak? I mean, does he knowingly take into account the economic benefits to the United States because of Russian military action?
Well, absolutely. Putin is actually, despite the fact that there's a lot of kind of mocking that goes on in Western media of Putin, and there's all sorts of propaganda that he is, sick with cancer and this or that. Putin is a master, strategist. And in my book, I described, his strategy. He's not only looking at the battlefield, right? He is bringing in sort of the big geopolitical picture. He's using cyber, he's using space, all of these weapons that he developed, right? They are built to exploit vulnerabilities in U.S. military posture and warfighting strategy. What do I mean by that? It is no coincidence that the Chinese have just been able to identify glaring gaps in our airspace security, right? The Russians are so much better in that. And so Putin is using all of those things, but in addition, he is looking at the geopolitical, big picture, the strategic environment, and there are tectonic shifts in that environment that are going on. Russia is getting closer to China, to Iran, to North Korea, and he's looking at all the globalists that are meeting and every year and planning about how to take over the world, and he knows how to generate dependency among those people, right, on Russia, on China. And so what's going on right now, there's a massive transfer of wealth from these military from American taxpayer, right? Because where does all this money come from? It's from us. It's from Peter, it's from Eric, it's from me, people like us, right? And it funnels through Ukraine because we're providing not only weaponry, we're providing training, we are paying pensions for Ukrainian government workers, for goodness sake. And so all of that wealth is transferring to the military industrial complex and to the global elites and to the financial investment firms like JP Morgan, BlackRock, Morgan Stanley, you name it. That's whom Zelensky is meeting with right now. He's not meeting with us. He's meeting with those top dogs.
Wait, did you realize that? You're telling me we're paying,
yes.
United States aid goes to pay Ukrainian pensions?
Yes. Yep. And pensions in the United States aren't guaranteed by our government. So it's a strange thing. But let me say this again. Vladimir Putin is a thug. He's ex-KGB. He wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union. He's a massive threat. But here's the concern that I have, Rebekah, and I want your keen analyst mind on this because you've looked at it, is it's unclear what the Biden administration strategy is. And you see hints of effectively unconditional surrender. They're talking about war crimes trials for Putin. Does he deserve to, go to trial? Absolutely. But the problem is the immediate point that you say unconditional surrender is our goal. You put Putin in a situation where it's do or die. He needs to win this war and escalate it. Maybe start using battlefield nuclear weapons,
which
whatever.
He's already threatened now.
Yeah, exactly. He's already threatened. But you put him in a corner where it's either do or die. And that seems to be the strategy. And that is the dumbest thing to do. It's one thing to say unconditional surrender for Adolf Hitler when he doesn't have nuclear weapons. But to say that to Vladimir Putin in this context is absurd. So what should the U.S. strategy be? And you talked about the need for some kind of a peace settlement agreement. Could you put some specifics to that? What should this agreement say? Where would the territorial line be? What could we do to give Putin something to save face so he would do this deal, but would also protect the integrity and the security of the Ukrainian people?
Sure. The first thing that I want to say, in the beginning, you said it's unclear what Biden's strategy is. Well, it's unclear because there isn't any. This traditional approach to warfare is this. You keep throwing weaponry and you keep throwing money and hope that the problem is going to go away. And guess what? We did that in Afghanistan. We sacrificed $2.2 trillion courtesy of American taxpayer and 6,000 American lives. And then at the end, after 20 years, we ran away and left $85 billion worth of top secret, top of the line, high tech military hardware to Taliban, the same people who wear towels on their heads. They're still running the country.
Yeah.
That's Biden's strategy. Okay, we don't have another 20 years. And so yes, the peace strategy that I have assessed, this is my professional intelligence assessment, that's what Putin would accept. Okay, as an intelligence officer, we don't tell what the policy and strategy should be because we're supposed to be unbiased, right? So we only talk about what the adversary's perspective is, right? And of course, Peter, you're absolutely right. It's an absurd strategy to push Putin into the corner and say, oh, this man cannot remain in power. It's not just Biden, it's Lindsey Graham. I used to respect Lindsey Graham, but he is now off his rocker, basically telling the Russian people need to remove Putin and need to stage a coup. I mean, what kind of madness is that? What is Putin going to do? Of course, he's going to get all these nukes ready. And he is. Remember, the nuclear forces that he put on special combat alert are still remaining there.
Well, and just to add, Rebekah, to your point, even if there were a coup, what guarantee is it that the new leader would be better than Vladimir Putin? There's no guarantee.
You would be worse, Peter.
Yeah.
Guess who is going to take over? It's Nikolai Patrushev, the head of Russia's Security Council, another, KGB assassin. These two are like this, they're close. They're not just professional colleagues, they're buddies because Patrushev executed a demolition of Grozny strategy during the Chechen war, right? This is the guy whom Putin trusts. Anyway, so it's all wishful thinking and fantasy that the Russians are going to remove Putin. Putin enjoys 79% approval rating. Joe Biden can only dream, in his wildest dream about such approval rating. But back to peace strategy that Putin potentially may approve. The reason I'm caveating it potentially, it's because Putin doesn't trust Biden. He doesn't trust the Washington establishment. He would trust somebody strong who is actually a deal maker, right? Somebody like the 45th president. But if he were, he could agree to if he is allowed to retain the 20% of the territory, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, the portions of Ukraine that he annexed, plus Crimea, right? And if the West were to acknowledge it as Russian, and the second thing, so there are three things. So that was the first thing. The second thing is, if Ukraine were to be legally guaranteed to be neutral, not a member of NATO, because that's his red line, and I can explain why that is his red line. And then the third thing, if Zelensky is removed and a more neutral government, were to be in charge of Ukraine. Other than that, he is planning on continuing annihilating Ukraine. Ukraine is right now basically ceasing to exist as a country. Its industrial base is destroyed. Its agricultural foundation is destroyed. Most of its critical energy infrastructure is destroyed. That's how he's progressing, because he decided that if he can't have it, we can't have it either.
So basically what we hear you saying is, because what he would accept, I don't think the West would be willing to do, based on all the coverage in terms of, they're not just going to take Ukraine out of NATO. I think Zelensky at this point, he's been very smart about aligning himself with important people. And so now he sees himself as they're connected in. They're not going to let him go. And if you got defense contractors set up to profit in 2024 and beyond, and they're pitching this as a long-term investment, what I hear basically everybody saying is we're going to continue to spend tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions, and eventually maybe trillions, like in Afghanistan, because that's just the way things are going. My question, and Rebekah, you mentioned how much Peter Schweizer has written about how Ukraine is corrupt. Before that, he also wrote extensively about actually Ronald Reagan's strategy to end the Cold War in Russia. And he's actually kind of got he's low-key a Russian file. So I guess I'm sort of interested in your assessment. I mean, what do you see as the key differences between the way Ronald Reagan approached the Cold War and how we're now dealing with Russia, and why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's what Rebekah was saying, weakness versus strength. I mean, Ronald Reagan, during the context of the Soviet Union, not only created this revolution in military affairs, which scared the daylights out of the CCP, he also challenged the moral authority of communism itself. It's going to end up on the ash heap of history. It's the evil empire. And that resonated with a lot of people. Now, in the context of Putin, Rebekah, things are obviously a little bit different. He's not outspokenly identified as a member of the Communist Party, although we know that's where his sympathies lie. But I think it is a stunning fact. People can draw their different interpretations from it. It is a stunning fact that the Russian government, specifically Vladimir Putin, has gone into Ukraine twice. In 2014, when Barack Obama was president and Joe Biden was vice president, then they skipped an administration, and then the Biden administration, they invaded Ukraine a second time. I'm not saying Trump does everything right, but Trump does instill fear and uncertainty among other major powers. And I think that's a problem with the Biden administration. Rebekah, what are your thoughts on this? Kind of final thoughts on what the posture should be of an American president. Let's assume we get to 2024. We have a chance to create a sort of hypothetical president to confront Putin. Who's the ideal, in the abstract sense, the ideal president? What should their policies be with regards to Russia and how we can beat back what Vladimir Putin is doing, as you highlight in your very excellent book, Putin's Playground?
Peter, I'm so delighted that you asked me this question, because the legacy media does not ask me this question because they don't want to talk about Trump. But despite the fact that there was this complete disinformation propagated by the big tech and the big media that Trump somehow was, Putin's friend or worse, right?
Right.
Putin
His client, yeah.
Right. Putin feared Trump. President Trump, the 45th, he pursued the most robust strategy against Russia since President Ronald Reagan. And let me tell you real quick, top 5 things that gave Putin a pause that Trump did in order to counter Russian doctrine and strategy. Thing number 1, President Trump stood up U.S. Space Force. The Russians stood up theirs in 2001. The minute that they got their hands on the report that's called the Rumsfeld Commission report that identified vulnerabilities in our satellites, Putin developed a strategy, or rather on his orders, the General Staff developed a strategy on how to attack our satellites in wartime and deafen and blind our forces. Well, President Trump understood that, and he stood up our Space Force that developed counter space weapons to attack the Russian satellites. Number two, President Trump authorized offensive cyber operations against Russia, which is a top dog in the cyber weapons realm, right? Obama was afraid to do that. Number three, President Trump kicked out the KGB-owned and run quote unquote antivirus Kaspersky software that the U.S. government, in its infinite wisdom, was running on government
That's so bad.
You can't make this stuff up, guys. I served in the government. I served in U.S. government, and some of this stuff you can't imagine what goes on, right? So it took Trump to just kick the heck out this Kaspersky KGB. Number four, in Syria, President Trump authorized a missile strike that killed 300 Russian mercenaries, okay? He called Putin and said, hey, Vlad, are these your guys, over there in Syria? And how Wagner Group, the Russian government, didn't recognize it as a military force, right? They just, convicts. And Putin said, no, what are you talking about? And Trump said, oh, good, because I'm just authorized a missile strike. And they were gone like that. And then the final and most important thing that President Trump did, he authorized the development of a low-yield sea-launched nuclear cruise missile, which would hold a low-yield tactical warhead. Okay. And that just struck at the heart of Putin's escalate to de-escalate strategy, according to which a low-yield nuclear warhead would detonate in the battlefield in Ukraine at this, point, right, in order to de-escalate conflict. Well, Trump, again, understood that. And he authorized this program for us. Well, guess what President Biden does the first day that he comes to office? He kills that program. I mean, Biden did awful things. I mean, in addition, and y'all have written about that, he killed the Keystone Pipeline that basically ratcheted up the prices on energy, and Putin's defense budget raised 1.5 times. So basically, Biden's action not only financed Putin's war in the beginning, they also emboldened it. And that's the truth. And until regular American folks understand, and here's the truth, and thanks to your podcast that you are, letting people know all this, until that happens all over the networks, this war is going to go on forever, because both Putin knows and Biden knows that there's fatigue that's setting in the United States among the American people. I mean, our attention span, there are a lot of wars going on. There's a war going on in Syria. Nobody talks about this anymore. And so that's what they are planning to achieve here with regard to Russia-Ukraine war.
Well, we've been talking with Rebekah Koffler, who is the author of Putin's Playbook, an excellent book that we'd recommend everybody read. If you can dissect Vladimir Putin's mind, this is the book that does it. She has a long history working both with the DIA and the CIA on these sorts of issues. Rebekah's been our guest today. Thank you for joining us. Eric, your final thoughts on this conversation about where we should go next?
It doesn't sound like we're going anywhere. It sounds like we're going to go to the ATM to continue to make massive withdrawals, to pump cash into Ukraine. And it's insane. I mean, I love Rebekah's take on it. And just to kind of give some context, for military aid, since the invasion, we gave Ukraine $46 billion, right? for the previous high from 2020, we gave Israel $3 billion. So, I mean, the amount of money we're spending in this country is insane. I personally did not know that we literally have purchased Ukraine.
Yeah.
If we're funding their pensions and the amount, I think the American people would be shocked to know. It's one thing to put a sticker on your car. It's another thing to know just how much we're paying for, and that the people are now pitching Ukraine as an investment, and that defense contractors won't start making money on this thing until next year. It just puts it in a very different context, and I very much appreciate, Rebekah, thank you for putting it in such an important, informed light that I think will help people think about it in the right way.
Yes, thank you, Rebekah, for joining us. We commend people to pick up her book. If you want to listen to our other podcasts, you can find them at thedrilldown.com, or you can find them on Apple, Google, all sorts of other locations. Thanks for joining us. Until next time.